Hey guys, it's James here from eBassGuitar, and I want to welcome you to a brand new project we're putting together called Real World Bass Heroes, and I'm delighted to welcome Ian King to this interview.
Cool, thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
So this is an interview series that we're putting together where we are discovering the extraordinary bassists which are the backbone of our business. And Ian has worked non-stop, and I kid you not, for the past 15 years. He's literally the first cool bass player in London's West End. He's worked on shows from Dreamgirls through to Shrek, through to Sister Act, through to Hairspray, through to Book of Mormon, and currently he's working on the legendary Hamilton show as well. Have I missed anything out there, Ian?
I think that was all of them. Yeah, I don't know, they all meld into one after a while, but no, yeah, you know, it's all good.
Yeah, and he's most recently become more of a household name, shall we say, because on YouTube recently it was featured Jesus Christ Superstar, and a lot of people heard his bass playing on there, and I thought it'd be absolutely fantastic to get him on and talk about his approach to start off to playing that show to begin with. So one of the things that's always stood out for me with your bass playing, Ian, is you have this incredible knack for playing fantastic bass fills.
Okay.
You're the kind of fills which fit perfectly with the music on one hand, yet can still make your jaw drop. And I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about your approach to doing that?
Okay. Well, firstly, that's very kind of you to say, and I'm not sure I'm a bass hero, but I'm a professional bass player anyway. I've been doing it for a long time. But yeah, I mean, in terms of approach to fills and bass playing, I think after a bit of trial and error over a few decades, you kind of work out that first and foremost, you're a bass player, you're playing this sort of supporting instrument. So I think that the timing of your fills is just all important. So you've got to get very aware of what's going on around you. So firstly, these days I clock more and more what the vocalist's doing, especially in shows, because obviously we're going to a show to hear a story, and a lot of that story is being told through the music. You know, it's not just in between songs. And in the case of Hamilton, it's only in the songs, you know. And so you've got to get out of the way of the singer. Also, you've got to make sure that if there's an important lead line going on, a trumpet's doing a section, or guitar's doing something, you know, that's kind of interesting, you don't want to get in the way, so you don't want to clash. So the first thing I do is try and find some nice gaps in which to sort of pop my head above the parapet, do something, and then pop back down without getting in the way, just adding a bit of musical interest, but without clashing and being a bit of a show-off, you know.
So what I say to my students here at eBassGuitar is 50% of your hearing, listening rather, is yourself, 50% of it is everything else.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
That's exactly what you're saying, because if you don't have the awareness of what the rest of the band is doing, you don't know where to place your fills.
That's it, yeah. And also I think you have to, once you've worked out where you can place fills, I think you have to kind of make a judgment call as to kind of how flash that fill can be. Sometimes it just needs to be in the same range that the bass line is at that point. Or there's other moments when you feel like this is a bit of an exciting moment, I could stick something up a bit further, like an octave higher or something, stick something a bit frilly, I'll call it, in, or like a trill or something that's a bit more flashy, that sounds a bit more special, but that's not always, you know, needed. So for example, for at the beginning of a song, like verse 1, it's like get out of the way, you know, you might put a little gentle fill in, you know, but you wouldn't really be putting up flashy stuff. But it might be that, you know, you get into a double chorus at the end of a song, and it requires a bit of something a bit flashy, so you would maybe stick something in at that moment. You know, I think that the best bass player I've seen for choosing the right moment was Randy Hope Taylor from who played with Incognito amongst a lot of others. And actually I was playing in Hairspray, and the guitarist on Hairspray took me down to a local club, which was just like a kind of soul function band, just playing a bunch of standards, you know, and it was Randy Hope Taylor on bass, and he had this absolutely incredible knack of finding really nice gaps in the music where maybe us mere mortals wouldn't know, that we might just stick a fill in at the end of a 4-bar phrase, but he was sticking them in, you know, in places you wouldn't expect, and it worked perfectly. So it kind of, even things like that just opened my eyes to think about when you play and think about what's needed, you know.
I remember that gig. I used to go to it myself a bunch of times.
There we go.
These are phenomenal players on
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, what everybody is wanting is to actually hear you start to demonstrate this stuff in practice. So I think it'd be really cool to take maybe one of the grooves from one of the shows you've done, maybe like Jesus Christ Superstar, for instance, and show us how you'd start creating some fills on that and your basic approach.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, let me have a think. I mean, to be honest, like I you know, I'm quite a sort of pentatonic kind of guy. So I think first and foremost is I think I try and play things in a comfortable position, and I don't trip myself up in terms of the positioning. Like, for example, if we were to look at, let's look at a G major pentatonic scale. So we might go 2, 4, 1, 4, 1, 4. So going across 3 strings, 2, 4 on the first one, up to 1, 4, and 1, 4 on the upper string. And I find that's correct, but I don't find that very comfortable myself. So personally, if for a major key, sometimes if I'm playing in a pentatonic style, I'll start with the first finger, and I'll instantly move up 2 frets, and I find lots of 1/3s a lot more comfortable. And then, so that might be my starting sort of approach for one. I'll just make things comfortable, you know. Also, it means that I start and finish on the same finger, being a 1. So I've got the next octave ready to go as well. And I kind of see shapes on the bass. I don't know about you, I'm sure you do as well, but I kind of, I'll see, you know, you see these box positions, and you see kind of, you know, shapes on the instrument where I can get into, and I know there's a lot of sort of, well, safe notes, if you will. So I get myself into a position where I can flow and kind of, you know, flow across a load of notes, knowing that they're all in the correct spot for whether we're in major or minor. And especially this thing of like starting on a note and finishing on the same finger. You know, if I wanted to do something a bit flash, I might just head up above, you know, the next octave quite quickly. You know, if I was just going, I might, you know, immediately go, well, I know my root note is there, my octave is here, so I could do the same thing up here. So I might, you know, that might sound a bit flash, but all I've done is I've made sure I got into the right position, you know, and with my sort of standard positioning, kind of get up there and do the same shape I would do down here up the octave, you know. So I mean, like, you know, we talked about Jesus Christ Superstar. If we think about like the kind of the verses of that, it's like starts in E, and then it goes up to a G, then A, and then back to E. So we literally got E, G, A, and back to E, you know. So what first thing I think is, well, are we major or minor for each one? You know, so I think that sounds a bit. I think it's just E, just a standard E chord to start with. You know, I'd think, is this G major? Yeah, that sounds better. It's not. It's major. Then A. Is it A major or minor? It's probably like an A7, you know, and then back to E. So I think, okay, so I know kind of where my pentatonic shapes are going to be, and then I think I often, you know, then we start to look for some interesting notes. I often pick out the 7th, you know, work out whether it needs a dominant 7th, a major or a minor, and that's kind of an interesting note. Often lots of thirds will give an indication of whether we're in major or minor as well. And I just kind of think with the way I put bass lines together, try and keep it interesting by often changing to a different octave, you know, chromatically fill in some spaces. If I was doing a G major triad, I would, you know, fill in between the 3rd and the 5th with, you know, and then so there's a few little standard things I kind of like pick from, and then I just kind of alternate them like a Rolodex of ideas and just try and keep changing, you know. So I might go, you know, so I'm kind of like, you know, going around the chords, but putting in something a bit different. But it's often from things I've played before. I'm not kind of this sort of genius coming up with new stuff all the time. It's like I'm picking out lots of little riffs and things I've used in the past, and I kind of think that's what will work at this moment.
So what I'd love
bring
to
it up, you know,
hear you do now is I could hear there's a very there's a groove within there which outlines the chord sequence. And what I'd love to hear you do is start off really simple.
Right.
We're in verse 1 here.
Yeah.
And then over a few bars or however long, start to ramp up the intensity to see what happens.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think also one thing I've not said yet is that you've got to incorporate like a bass line, like a sort of a main groove that we base things on. It can't be changing all the time. So for example, the drummer, he might be going bang bang, you know, giving it sort of 2 quavers at the beginning of each one, gung gung ja, or whatever. So you might want to try and lock in with what the bass drum's doing. It's important to sort of base everything on a groove and then put fills on top of that.
What would your basic groove from that Jesus Christ Superstar idea be?
It might be going. So there's kind of like a bang bang at the beginning of each bar, you know, and that's kind of the main thing that we say.
So we sort of strip it back to its simplest groove. So
okay.
Hear that, and then start adding in the extra bits.
Yeah. Okay. So it might start by going like. And then a bit busier. Like bringing fifths in, you know. Or something like that, but you can sort of see I'm sort of trying to build it up. Some of it's gone well, some of it hasn't, but but yeah, you get the idea. Yeah,
because there's so much I could talk about from I don't know, from that 1 minute you just played there, but I want to pull out for me what is the most important thing. And if the edit of this video here, if you could see me, you can see my head going back and forth there, and that is because there's something about Ian's bass playing which is starting to make me dance a little bit there, and that for me is because the groove is just so inherently there. If you were to take that out and put all the clever fills in without that solid groove there would be something missing. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That's the idea. It's got to still flow, and and it's got to still feel like a song. You know, it can't just be like a bass solo. You know, so that's sort of what I'm trying to achieve. You know, whether the fills go well or not is another thing. But you've got to sort of be a bass player first, and then creating musical interest sort of second. You know, but the main thing is kind of trying to lock down what you're playing. You know, with the drummer to start with. So
there were basically 2 fundamental scales that you were building your fills from there. Can you elaborate what those are?
Yeah, I mean, generally, so I talked about the sort of pentatonic thing, and so for example, if we had an E, we're playing an E, so like we do pent meaning 5, so it's like the 5 most important notes of a scale, and then stick the octave on the top. So I'd be going O, 2nd fret with my 1st finger, 4th fret with my 3rd finger, and then same on the next string, 1, 3, and up to 1. So that's kind of the basis of, like, if I was in major. If I was in minor, it'd be like, so you could either go 1 to 4, 1, 3, 1, 3, or maybe start on a 3rd finger and go 3 up to 1, move that up and go 1, 3, 1, 3. So they're kind of like the basics that that I kind of base things on, but I kind of like to use maybe the blues scale versions of each. So with the blues scale version, like if we did a major one, we're adding an extra note in, which kind of is like the blues note, something that's not quite from that scale, but gives it a bit of tension.
How would you do that over the major pentatonic?
Yeah, so if we've got the major, if we go back to the major, you've got E, like that. That's our main pentatonic. So I would stick a note in between the second and third notes I play. So I'd go. But we're calling it blues scale because there's something going on that's a bit bluesy, a bit of a clash. So I've got the root note, second, and there's the third. So I'm sticking in the minor third as well. So we've got two to give a bit of a bit of a bluesy sound. So I've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 1, 3, 1. So for example, if I'm on that scale, if I'm going up, I might go I might miss out that next note and just go 2, 3, 1, 3, 1. On the way back down, I might go 1, 3, 1, and then instead of going the 3 and the 2, I might go 2, 1, 0. So there's a slightly different sound. It's a bit happier on the way up, a bit sadder on the way down. So, and I often use those notes sort of to start fills because they're kind of a bit interesting. Don't always want to start on a root note. I might want to start somewhere else. So a fill might be like, something like that, or so I'm kind of like using that clash of major and minor third going on down here as just a bit of musical interest, and I do a kind of lot of sliding around, that kind of thing.
I'll tell you what I absolutely love, and it's a real thrill to talk to other bass players, is that we're always learning. And I've played that pattern millions of times over the past 20 years plus, but I've never ever conceived that as being like the major blues scale before. I think that's it's really nice way to think about it.
I guess so, yeah. I mean, again, I hadn't, it's more recent years where I've got more and more into teaching as well, and I had to sort of think about it a bit, and I kind of thought, well, I guess that is like, we always think of the blues scale as just the one based on the minor. So
yeah,
if we were on A, for example, we'd go 1, 4, and then 1, and we'd stick in this 2, 3. So what the blues note in that scale would be this flattened fifth. So what we sort of find is music gets interesting when there's a bit of tension and release. So if we just played all the right notes all the time, it would be fine, but not particularly exciting to the ear. So the more we can add a bit of tension and then kind of resolve that tension, the more we make music. And then you find, like, a lot of jazz guys, they'll go off for a long time before they come back to resolving things because they've got this amazing knowledge of harmony. They'll create loads of tension before the release, But in a simpler term, I do it more in the sort of pop stuff I do. Whereas, I would be going. So on a minor, or what I would just think of that as the blues scale. You get loads of stuff, like Blues Brothers and stuff, and there was all those kind of bass lines, and they've got that, and it has a bit of a wrong note, if you will, which is then released with the tension's been released with the right note, So I kind of thought of that in the major way as well. If we go back to that E example, you've got that wrong note being the minor third. What's it doing there with the major stuff? But it kind of adds a bit of interest, and by going tension release, it kind of makes music sound interesting,
So for these folks, for folks who are starting out, just learning to put fills into their playing and discovering this wonderful world, is it safe to say that if you see a minor chord, you will use the minor blues scale? And if you see a major, you will use your major blues scale?
Yeah, that's kind of my sort of starter point, really, and then you just start to find, I would literally, that's how I would start things, and then you start to find some interesting notes that sort of stand out. Like I said, often, if we look at scales, the third note of the scale is your main one to give you an indication of major or minor, and then for a bit of flavour, we often look at sevenths to start with. So you can put a lot of little fills together using those two notes, and that can be quite a fun thing. A lot of the double stops that we all play on bass, are kind of thirds and sevenths. We've just worked out where to play them, and you could go up high, something like that would be like, we've got the A there, that's your dominant seventh, and then the third up the octave, so we've got like a dominant seventh thing. So you the bass is such a wicked instrument because we've got such ridiculous range. People think of it as just the low notes, but you can do things like that where you kind of put some, we're up in guitar territory there, but they haven't got this beautiful low note we can add to it. So the spread of sound that we can create on the instrument, you know, is cool. So yeah, I mean, in terms of layering up fills, I'd start with kind of blues scaly things and then just stick in a few cheeky sevenths and third things. And even things like, you know, ninths are very nice as well. Sometimes we can do it like, you know, often that's a kind of standard bass thing we all do, where we kind of go from the root fifth to the octave and then slide it up to the ninth and back. There's so many bass lines that have a lot of that going on, don't they, you know?
Only the other day for my Bass Lab University students, I was teaching them Ain't No Stopping Us Now, if you remember that bass line.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Is that, yeah.
Yeah.
That's it, yeah.
There you go.
That's good. Yeah, so that's literally like a, you know, here's your lesson in the ninths.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a great bass line that. I haven't played that for about 20 years or something, Christ.
There we go, yeah.
Yeah.
So we talked about note choice for fills, and you've given us some great little sort of knowledge bombs of those extra notes that you can add in for the flavour, so the blues notes and the ninths, that kind of thing. Rhythmically, what's the most important thing when creating a fill for you?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think you know, where to start the fill in the bar is quite interesting, you know. And I think, for example, if we just always start fills just, you know, bang on beat 1 or beat 3, for example, it's okay, but it can be a little bit interesting. So sometimes it's kind of nice to, you know, choose a moment for when the fill comes in. And I'm trying to think rhythmically, I don't go too mad. I don't really do you know, any kind of crazy rhythms in terms of like stupidly fast stuff myself. But I just think it's kind of important to try and incorporate the bass line in your fills, you know, like make sure that you don't, you know, if you're playing a fill, try not to make it, you know, have a completely contrasting groove to the main bass line you've been playing for the whole song. So I think rhythmically I would try to keep it as similar to the bass line as possible, and maybe just add in, you know, maybe I might double up the speed, you know, if we're playing something quite, you know, crotchet and quavery, if you will. I might stick a few 16s in just with a little fill and kind of flow back down to where I was, you know. So I think it's kind of yeah, it's where you start in the bar can have a big difference. I also tried to do fills by not starting on the root note. I think that's a kind of a good exercise to do at home when you're just jamming along to stuff. Like we all, you know, we're bass players, so we're used to kind of outlining the harmony. But you know, you might be playing a bass line, you know. So I don't want the fill to be, you know, you know, sometimes it's nice to start somewhere else than the root note, and then maybe start, yeah. So we might be going, yeah, you know. You know. So I don't know, I think I'm just kind of like, my fill didn't just go one, you know, because it's a bit too prescribed, it's a bit too obvious, you know. So I want to maybe start somewhere, maybe start on an and, you know, in between a strong beat or something like, you know.
Typically, when you've got a phrase, think of it, I know, 4, 8, 16, or however long the phrase is. Yeah. Where would you place your fill?
So, yeah, it's another good point. I mean, you know, there are some obvious spots, aren't there? You know, after 4 bars or 8 or whatever, you know. But it also kind of, I've found some of the most interesting fills. Like I've learned off people like Pino Palladino. He does this great thing where he might. Again, he won't do a fill where you expect it at the end of a, you know, we've done 4 bars, here's a fill to finish, and we start again. He might do things like, we've finished, you know, a round of 4 or 8, and then he'll do a thing of a lovely bit of movement at the beginning of the next bar, you know? So it's not quite where you think, and he often does things where he changes octave. So I'm thinking of an example. I mean, we just did something in A there, you know, so we've come to the end of the 4 bars, you know, you might go, you know, from beat 1. So it's sort of, you kind of think, oh, that was interesting. So because there might have been a bit of space in the music there on beat 1. So like, because otherwise we could go, you know, we're doing this bass line, you know, we get to the end, you know, which is kind of fine, but it's sort of it's a little bit obvious. So Pino might do something where he might go, and we're on the last bit, you know. So he's done this little flurry of stuff right at the beginning of the next section, which is kind of like, oh, that's a bit interesting. It just poked out where I wasn't expecting it, you know. So I just think I love stuff like that, you know. I mean, I'm not saying I can do it as well as him.
You've got a 4-bar phrase, actually placing something interesting on the first bar of that. So particularly if you're trying to ramp up intensity or something like that, that could be a place to do that. Drummers often do it by filling over the bar line, don't they?
Yeah, that's it.
Maybe beat 2 or 3 of the next bar, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's it.
They're kind of all of these options there. And rhythmically, what's the most important thing? Is it to come out right at the end of the fill?
Yeah, well, in fact, that's a good point, because I think sometimes you see it in other players, and you kind of probably see it. You know, you see yourself in other players when they make this slight mistake. Sometimes you could see you could see that the fill's coming. It's coming. Here we go. It's coming, and then I'm going to stick my fill in, and then they stack the next bit. So it's kind of, I think it's really important to think of your fill and how that fill is going to carry on back into the groove. It's actually more important that we get back to the bass line, you know, intact, and it's not, you know, lost any of its intensity, because if you did the world's most amazing fill, but then we got back to the beginning of the next bar and there was no bass for a couple of beats because I don't know where I am now, I've got to take a few seconds to regroup, then that's not worth doing the fill, you know. So I think it's really important to make sure that your fill is something that, like we say, it fits with the music, but it flows straight back into the bass line. If we don't do that.
Earlier you talked about tension and release, and you were talking about it in a note choice harmonic sense. But now I think it's exactly the same rhythmically. You have the rhythmic tension and release. Yeah, that's true, exactly. And when you play a very, this is the way I conceive it in my head, and tell me if you agree, that when you play a fast, rhythmically interesting pattern, that's the tension.
Yes, yeah.
And then it needs to be released.
Yes, yeah.
On beat 1 of the bar. But if
that's
that
it.
Isn't right.
Yeah.
The whole thing is kind of...
Yeah, no, exactly that. Yeah, because I think, for example, exactly that. Like we kind of want to hear, our ears are listening out for it to be righted, to land correctly, you know. So if we hear a big fill, we want to know it's going to come back to somewhere really comfortable. And you know, I think the listener needs to know it's going to be, you know, landing in the right place and everything's okay as well. Like this sort of thing of, like you say, if a fill, you know, is amazing, but it doesn't flow back into the line, it's it's not very comfortable to listen to as well as play, you know. So
moving on, how do you go about preparing? You've done some pretty big high profile work over the last 15 years. What's your process to prepare for that?
Okay, I mean, for example, if we think about, like we talked about Jesus Christ Superstar, that was you know, a lot of the work I do, the sort of high pressure stuff is usually because you can't have, you know, if I'm doing a big gig which is a rhythm section and a large orchestra, we can't have everyone sitting around rehearsing for weeks on end. It's going to be straight in, read it, get on the stage, earn the money and go home, you know. So there's not a lot of time, so the prep is very important, you know. So for something like Jesus Christ Superstar, there's been a few different albums and versions of it that have been done in the past. I mean, the original album they did with Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber years ago was such a masterpiece, because you could there's so much invention going on. You could hear they had these great ideas, and they also had a great bunch of musicians and singers that you could just see were in a moment, and it all happened. So it was important that I clocked the vibe of what was going on the original. And then there was a version that had happened in the West End, and I think they did a recording as well, and Steve Pearce had played bass on that, and he's just such a fantastic player. I mean, talk about, you know, playing the right thing in the right way at the right time. He's one of the masters. He just sounds beautiful all the time. So I clocked what he'd done, and there was one particular song called What the Fuzz or something, I think it's called, and he put a lovely double stop thing in, and I was like, oh, that's got to be stolen immediately, you know. So I played a bit of that. So anyway, so I clocked lots of things that had gone on before, and actually, funnily enough, there was one of the rehearsals, there was a bunch of like press had come. Again, it was all very quick. We're sort of music thrown in front of us for a day or two, and then suddenly there's camera people there, and Andrew Lloyd Webber had turned up. And there was one of the songs, I forget which one it was, and I'd heard on one of the original recordings that there was this kind of interesting little chordal thing the bass player had done. I think it just kind of gone up, I can't remember what it was now, but it was kind of like a, you know, and back down and all this. And I remember at home thinking, I better get my hands around that, because like if it's in the part and I'm reading it, it might slow things down. So I've got my hands around it, and then it wasn't in the part as such. So we played, and then during the rehearsal, Andrew Lloyd Webber came over to me actually, and he said, oh, can you do this thing? I remember the bass player did this thing, we went up and down, and I said, oh, do you mean this? And he was like, yep, that's it. And I was kind of secretly pleased with myself because I'd actually clocked it before, you know. So it's just a story that really, you know, rams home the importance of preparing, you know. I mean, you just need to have clocked what's going on before, you know. You can't always see the music before, but you can listen to recordings or similar stuff to get in the vibe, you know. And with the West End stuff, in terms of preparation, it gets sort of easier and easier really for people to prepare for depping on shows, because there's these days, you know, not only do you get the written music and a dep recording, you'll get these days a video of like the MD cam, which has got the MD conductor on it, which you can put on your computer, and you can practice along at home. So there's sort of ample opportunity to sort of literally practice what it's going to be like when you're in the pit. So there's sort of no excuse for not knowing how the charts go for the West End stuff. Rather.
So how important is it for you to be able to read music?
In my personal, you know, experience, it's been very important, because I often get, you know, thrown in at the deep end, and you just need to, you know, you just need to be able to read on the fly. I mean, one of the things I did just before lockdown was Disney recording a new version of The Little Mermaid, and Phil Mulford had been doing some recording for the film. And then they needed an extra day of recording, and he'd already been booked to do something else at Abbey Road. So I got asked to go in, and I had to, you know, read a couple of songs. There was a really good song which I remembered from my childhood, Under the Sea, I think it's called, from that, which has got this fantastic little, you know, calypso-y bass line. And I'm reading it, and behind the glass is Alan Menken, who's written the thing, you know, however long ago. So the pressure is ridiculous. So you need to have, you know, I personally need to have my reading chops together. That's a sort of a real sight reading instance. But the West End stuff, you need to be able to read well, because there's often a lot of music. I mean, Hamilton's got 51 songs back to back. It's it blows your mind. But the sight reading element of the West End is less important, because you've got time to prepare often, you know. But you know, either way, you've got to be able to read.
And how much of it is strictly notated, and how much of it is down to interpretation, like the stuff we were talking about earlier about?
Yeah. Well, I've had a sort of maybe a 50-50 split over my career of shows, where some of them, I mean, I've often been booked for things because I bring a bit of flair to bass lines. So, I mean, the first show I did was called Daddy Cool, and it was all the music of Boney M, and I got, you know, quite a lot of room to do my thing and really play quite busily over it. Hairspray had about half and half. There's a bit of room to do your own thing, but quite heavily written. I did Sister Act, and that was very disco-y, so I got to, even though the charts were quite heavily written, I just kind of roared all over them, which was quite fun. I did Shrek next, which was it was a bit more written. There was lots of double bass in that, and it was sort of quite strict parts. A little bit of room, but more of a written part, that one. Then I did the Book of Mormon, which I'd say about half and half. Quite written, but room to do my thing. It needed a bit of flair, so I could put my thing in that a bit. What did I do after Book of Mormon? Oh, I did Dreamgirls, and that was lots of R&B. So again, written, but I was booked to bring something to the party, to give it a bit of flair. And Hamilton is much more locked down in terms of the parts. They're very heavily written. Only a few moments to put your own thing in, but luckily they're very well written parts. The music is fantastic, and it's so important that you don't play over this rapping, because you're listening to the story through the rapping. So if you start doing a bass solo, people can't hear what happened, and they're going to want their money back. So yeah, I'd say probably more often than not, I have a bit of room to do my thing, and there's just been a few that it's not been the right thing to do, to play over it all over. So
if you're a Dep and the American version of that is sub, and you're going to cover in the show, what sort of materials do you get to prepare?
Well, yes, you'll get these days. Often, you usually get stuff in a Dropbox folder from the chair holder, and it will be the written music, the pad of music, what we call a Dep recording, which is just a pit recording, which has been recorded off the personal mixer of the actual musician. So it's exactly their mix and what the person will hear when they go to do the show. And then also these days you get because there's a camera on the MD, and he's sort of halfway between the stage and the pit, so we can't often see them that well. So they put a camera on them, and then they put little TV monitors next to our music stands. So often the sound department will kindly do a video or actually, film it for us, record it for us even, and then we get given that as well. So the person at home can have a computer screen up with the music on it and the MD and the recording, and have literally like the experience of the pit, without the dead mice, one song that's quite fun is on the Book of Mormon. There was a song called All American Prophet, which was a halfway house between quite heavily written, but also there was a few moments where I could put my vibe into it. Often it's quite written, but you can just slightly change things to give it your sound, So I could play along to that if you like. I could go share my screen and then do that.
So Ian, that was amazing. I absolutely loved listening to you play that stuff there.
Cheers.
It brings me on to thinking, as we all want to know, what gear do you use? Can you give us a bit of an overview of what would be your typical bass setup?
Yeah, okay, well, I mean, for West End shows, I often find a 5-string bass is a must, because they don't really care about the range of a 4-string bass in the West End. You often, if you walk in with a 4-string bass, the first thing you'll see is a low E flat written, and you'll be like, oh, you know, so often just, you know, even if you desperately want to use your 4-string P bass, which is your prized possession, I think for the sort of work that I'm doing, a 5-string is important. Some shows there's a fretless element, but not all. But in terms of equipment, like if we talk about like pedals and stuff, I mean, actually the first thing to mention is amps aren't a big thing in pits anymore. They call them silent pits, which means no amplification. So often we've got our personal mixers. You know, there's the Roland is the one I use at the moment. I forget the model number, but we also use these ones called Avioms, which is a make. And anyway, so because there's no amp, for bass players, we like to control things. We're quite into sort of controlling. So it's important, I find, to have a little preamp pedal, you know, so you can control. Well, first of all, you can mute yourself when you don't want it to be live, but also you can control a bit of EQ at your end. It's almost like having an amp with you with no speaker. You know, you can adjust things. So I use an EBS Microbass 2. I think there's a 3 version out now, but I love that. I love the sound of the EBS stuff. Sometimes I use a volume pedal, sometimes it's not needed. So I find that the most important thing is tuning and switching and a bit of EQ. So a standard setup for a show which doesn't need effects would be maybe a volume pedal, maybe not, but definitely a preamp pedal, a tuner, and if you need to switch between instruments, you've got to think about that as well. So some of the preamps have got 2 channels. I use a Providence Audio one in Hamilton, which is the same channel twice, and I can switch between the 2. So yeah, I'd have a preamp and tuners, and that's your sort of standard go-to setup. And then some shows need effects. Not a lot of shows need effects on electric, but I mean, Hamilton, for example, being a hip-hop thing, it's got this monstrous setup. It's hilarious. It's there's 2 octavers for different settings, so they can be set and forget and just turn them on and off. One of the songs I play, there's an octaver on, there's a tremolo and a chorus, and I'm playing with a plectrum all at once. It's just kind of funny, and you're kind of tap dancing, turning different things off and on throughout that song. You know, it might not need the octaver for one bit, but it needs the tremolo and chorus, you know. So there's a bit of that going on, and with the double bass, I've got, a Fishman preamp for that. There's tuners everywhere, you know, and it's kind of, there's a huge board on Hamilton, but that's not your standard thing really. You often need, like I just say, it's all about EQing and switching and making everything nice and quiet. You know, you don't really want a big string of noisy effects. And also, if anything goes wrong, you don't want to be scrabbling around on the floor looking for which one's gone wrong. So for example, in the Hamilton setup, they've got one of these true bypass loop things. So basically you have lots of pedals built into plugged into the loops of a little switching system, so that when the switching, you leave all the pedals on, but you could just switch them into the signal chain with this little controller on the front. Guitarists use it a lot, and where that's useful is if a pedal goes wrong, power supply goes or something like that, if it's not switched on with the looping control, it's not in your signal chain. Right. And ironically, there's an even funnier thing where they've got a single loop pedal, and they put the entire loop system in the loop of that single loop pedal. So if the loop system goes wrong, there's a get out of jail free card. So there's like loop systems within loop systems. It's just, it's hilarious.
Sounds like mission control.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit over the top in a way, but it's kind of fail safe. So if anything goes wrong, I could hit this one button and essentially my bass sound will go straight through, not touching anything. But that's a bit of a,
If there's no amp there, how are you listening to yourself?
Well, from the well, the last thing in your signal chain, so often the preamp pedal, it will go out, you know, through to a DI box off to the sound department, and then they'll be wiring it back into these personal mixers, so Avioms or Rolands or various different makes, and then on that you'll have every single instrument in the band labelled with its own volume control, and you literally can just set your own mix, and on top of that be vocals, click tracks, backing tracks, often the MD's on a little clip-on mic, and they can talk to you. If anything goes wrong, they can shout at you. So it's funny, you're sort of playing this music, but you're kind of, it is a bit mission control, because you've got, you know, different clicks and voices. There's even stage management, all these different things going on in your ears, which you've got to be kind of...
You're going through headphones the whole time.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, either chunky headphones like this, or I've got some molded in-ear monitors for the pit, which is really good for getting rid of any sound that you don't want, you know, in your ears. So it's very controllable. It's very specific these days, you know, and you know, you can actually set up a kind of studio quality mix of what you're hearing. I mean, they even have to, they make a channel with audience noise these days, because it can be quite isolating, you know, with these molded in ears and your perfect mix. And, you know, if you're not careful, you can forget that there's 1,600 people out there listening to what you're playing, you know. So yeah, you can bring a bit of the audience sound in as well, which is quite funny.
Well, Ian, it's been absolutely amazing talking to you, getting this huge insight into your professional career for the past 15 years, from the playing earlier and the bit from the Book from Mormon we just heard. It's really clear why you should continually work. So just to wrap up, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give any young budding bass player wanting to get into the kind of work you do then?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think personally, you've got to make music feel good. So it's important to know. It's really important to know our harmony, know what's going on in music. But our role as a bass player in a band is to lock in with the drums, as well as, you know, give an indication of what the harmony is. But our main job is to make the music feel good, you know. So I think, you know, work on your groove, work on playing the basics well. I mean, my career has been based on, it's not been up this end, it's been kind of making it feel good down here, making it feel comfortable. You know, often drummers put you up for gigs, so make sure that you play in a comfortable place and play the basics well. So I would just say, try not to get too, you know, hung up on, I need more vocabulary, I need to be the fastest at this and the fanciest at that, and I need to know the next mode and scale. Just try and make music feel good. Play along to loads of great music, like check out the best bass players, and sort of try and understand why they've continued, you know, to work their whole careers as well. So yeah, just make music feel good, basically. That's what I'd say.
Essential advice. Well, thank you, Ian, for joining us on the very first Real World Bass Heroes interview series. It's been amazing having you, and I'll catch you very soon.
Nice one. Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks for having me.